Hello, and welcome to this deeper dive into the cycle of depression, addiction, and compulsion versus the cycle of healthy living or recovery. I talked quite a bit about the cycle of depression, addiction, compulsion in the Four Horsemen of the Autonomic Apocalypse. That's a video series you'll find elsewhere on this site. The Four Horsemen include depression, anxiety, addiction, and compulsion because those are the most common presenting issues in a counseling process. And there's rightfully so, these are the most prominent issues that come up, and I think this presentation may show you why that's the case. So I want to compare it though in here. Something I haven't done yet is to compare it to a healthy cycle of living rather than the downward spiral of depression and addiction. So to begin with, we'll look at this composite picture of the whole process of that cycle of depression. And you'll see here that there's depressive thinking down here at the bottom of the cycle, right here, and that triggers emotionally arousing rumination. That's a big culprit right there. And then we have trouble at night sleeping because of the sleep disturbance that comes with trying to solve a lot of unsolvable problems. And then we wake up tired and exhausted by morning, and that creates a lot of other problems that we'll get into. So we're going to start with this little guy here. This is the depressive thinker, and that's where it all starts off. And a lot of people in cognitive behavioral therapy and CBT programs will refer to these types of thinking as distorted thinking or irrational thinking or irrational beliefs. And I like to call them magical thoughts because they're usually created by the mind of a child, and they've been with us about that long. Kids think in fairy tale language, and so they come up with all these different ways of distorting the reality they find themselves in, and that might help them survive. I'll just go through a few of them you'll recognize, I think. And first one is about should thinking. I shoulda, coulda, woulda done it this way if I had to do it over again. Or why didn't I do it that way? I could have done it this way or would have done it that way if I'd have known. Then overgeneralizing. I never get what I want. Nothing ever works out for me. Or it always rains when I want to go to the park, which isn't true. We've all been to the park on a sunny day. Then there's doing my pain in advance. And this is like a dress rehearsal for disasters that most often don't even occur. 9 out of 10 times doing your pain in advance is unnecessary because it never really comes out that way. Then there's mind reading, thinking you know what other people are thinking about you even when they don't say and even when you don't ask. And then there's personalizing, which is where somebody makes a reference to someone else, but they don't give the name of that person. And so then we personalize or take it personal like they're talking about me. Then there's that core belief that many people carry who have toxic shame, and usually toxic shame is a big part of dysfunctional upbringing. A lot of families are shame-based, and so there's a lot of I'm not good enough, I'm not tall enough, I'm not smart enough, and society kind of sends those messages too, as we all know. And then there's catastrophizing or miserabilizing. I think some people call it making a mountain out of a molehill, but catastrophizing is looking at all the worst possible outcomes and then playing them on the movie theater of our mind. And when we do that, we realize the feelings that go with that catastrophe, even though the catastrophe most often doesn't even play out that way. And then miserabilizing is taking the worst feelings and just kind of wallowing in them sometimes and just like agonizing over why does this always happen to me? Then there's thinking with my feelings. If I feel a certain thing, it must be true. Like, if I feel stupid, I must be stupid, even though there's tons of evidence that that's not the case. And a real big one is I can't stand this, which is 99.9% of the time not true because we are standing it or we wouldn't be able to sit there and say I can't stand this. So the problem with these thought patterns and these styles of thinking that may have helped us in our childhood is that they don't work very well for coping skills in our adult life. And depressive thinking creates open loops. Now, what do I mean by open loops? So whenever there's a perceived threat, then the problem-solving part of our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, comes out to try and close the open loop. And the loop starts with that perceived threat. So the contemplator or the problem solver has to decide, okay, what needs to happen here? What's going on and what needs to happen? And creates a plan and then carries out that plan in number 3 over there, and then closes the loop when the plan successfully does what it's supposed to do. That's how it's supposed to work, and that's what a loop is. And we're people who like to close open loops. Something happens, we figure out what it is, we act on it, and we close that loop and get some closure. But a lot of loops won't close, especially those from childhood that are core beliefs that came from the mind of a child without any experience and without understanding that what other people do says more about them than it does me as a child. Children tend to take things personal. Of course, they're personalizers. There must be something wrong with me or I wouldn't be treated this way. So a lot of loops can't be closed, especially when they're limiting beliefs or core beliefs or traumas or attachment wounds or a lot of those things that we've talked about in the iceberg and some of the other videos here. But what happens then is with the cycle of depression, with those kinds of unclosable loops, the problem solver becomes the ruminator, is what I call it. And the ruminator tries to close those unclosable loops, and they're considered threats, and its job is to solve or resolve threats and problems, or to chew and stew on threats and challenges just to get them taken care of so we don't have to worry about them anymore. And the ruminator does not like to give up, and so the ruminator can get really good at ruminating, especially if it's been ruminating a lot, because remember, neurons that fire together wire together, and use it or lose it is the other side of that equation. But every time we go through these cycles, we're making those neural networks stronger and bigger and more sophisticated. So when a perceived threat comes up, it triggers the stress hormones to be released, the stress response, which is that fight or flight red zone stuff that we talked about in the window of tolerance and the autonomic ladder. You know, find out what I mean by autonomic nervous system if you want to watch that video. It's a little bit outside the scope of what we want to talk about here, so I just want to say that perceived threats trigger that response. And so the problem solver comes out, and when it can't solve it and can't close the loops, then it just continues to chew and stew and try to solve or resolve it. And all the while, that threat gets stronger, and so the stress response releases adrenaline and cortisol into our system. And those are some big operators when it comes to some of the issues we find ourselves facing. And we'll talk more about those here in a minute. Those unclosable loops then trigger that ruminator, and the rumination tends to intensify the release of those hormones, making everything worse. And then the ruminator activates parts of self to employ defensive strategies to protect us against further wounding or from getting engulfed by the feelings and so forth. And remember, some loops can't be closed. They must be healed, especially those limiting beliefs. That's a theme we need to keep coming back to, because repetition and intensity is how we burn it into our system. So I like to repeat things, and I hope that's not too annoying to you, but I think it's for a good purpose. So again, the ruminator does not like to give up, but sooner or later it has to go to sleep. And when it does, the subconscious mind comes to the rescue, of course. Now, keep in mind that the subconscious is supposed to be doing maintenance work while we sleep. That's when it has access to all of our energy, and it can swap out our skin cells and grow our hair and heal our body and do all kinds of maintenance work. But when we go to sleep, our mind tends to continue doing what it was doing before we drifted off. And if we were ruminating and ruminating over a lot of unclosable loops, then those loops are still there, and the subconscious takes over while the ruminator sleeps, and it continues trying to close those open loops and uses these metaphorical scenarios that we call dreams. And sometimes they're pretty weird dreams, because the subconscious mind, the right brain, is typically very symbolic, and so the language of the right brain is symbolism and creativity. And So we have these weird dreams. Well, those weird dreams interfere with some of the energy that's supposed to be devoted to maintaining the body and so forth. And so then there's a lot of extra work. It's like the subconscious is moonlighting. And if it continues doing that all night long, then it's creating more stress, and that stress is dumping more adrenaline and cortisol into the system, and those stress hormones then disturb our sleep, and we have impaired sleep. We call that insomnia. And it could be early, middle, or late. You could wake up in the middle of the night or wake up early in the morning and can't get back to sleep. But regardless of that, when we have all that work going on, then the subconscious does not get enough rest and we don't feel recuperated, so we wake up feeling kind of loopy in the morning. And that starts our day off with open loops, and that's not a good thing. And remember, some loops can't be closed, they must be healed. So when we wake up loopy in the morning and have all those other open loops to start our day, that's not a good thing because the depressive thinking gets worse. Impaired sleep impairs functioning, and impaired sleep impairs mood and energy. We become lethargic or apathetic, and we don't have a lot of energy to sometimes even get out of bed in the worst case scenario. Then all of this then releases more stress hormones into the body. Cortisol reduces serotonin levels. And we go to the doctor then after a few cycles like this, and we tell him we're depressed, we're anxious, we can't sleep at night. So he'll typically prescribe medication like an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, allowing our own serotonin to build up in our system so that we can feel better. And he also may give us a sleep aid. That's becoming less of a choice these days, and rightfully so, because they can be addictive. So the doctor has done what he can and gave us a prescription for SSRIs and for the sleep aids, and they help a little bit, but not enough, and so the grouch comes out. Wow, the doctor can't help, the medicine can't help, nothing helps. And the feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness continues to grow. That releases even more cortisol and adrenaline into the system, although the adrenaline begins to wane after a while, and apathy and lethargy takes over, and that impairs our motivation. We don't have any energy, we don't want to do anything, and so our basic needs begin to suffer, and our relationships begin to suffer. A grouch don't want to be around nobody, and nobody wants to be around a grouch. And so with the grouch coming out and everything getting worse, things start to tumble out of control. And that's when the shame-based inner critic comes out and tries motivating the depressive thinker. The critic speaks in second person, saying you, like you're stupid, or you're doing this wrong, or something's wrong with you. So it carries a book of shoulds in one hand and a hammer in the other. And it plays disaster fantasies of your future in the mind's eye. Says things like, you should be ashamed of yourself, or you're not good enough, or tall enough, or smart enough, or you never do anything right. And then ask, what's wrong with you? Now, the depressive thinker will speak in first person, and it will say, I should be ashamed of myself, and I'm not good enough, or tall enough, or smart enough, or I'm never going to be able to do anything right, and what's wrong with me? So you can tell the difference between the depressive thinker and the inner critic by first and second person. But both of them tend to make the depressive thinking get worse. So with things getting worse or beginning to spiral out of control, the ruminator's job gets bigger. It has to find a way to hold things together. But keep in mind the ruminator becomes more and more impaired and has difficulty exercising its executive functioning, and its problem solving and planning abilities start to become impaired and affected by the cortisol flowing through the system. Remember, cortisol's job is to power down any unnecessary resources in the system so they can divert all that energy into just survival mode, which is more instinctive than executive functioning would be. And so the ruminator does not have full control of all the capacities that it would have if things were in a more balanced state. So the priority then becomes comfort and relief now, and that's the main job. And the ruminator has to figure out how can we bring comfort and relief in, how can we get off this hamster wheel, and so in ride the hired guns, addictions and compulsions. Now, we all know that addictions and compulsions make things worse, but the ruminator is impaired and it can't see the future and it can't do the normal planning activities. It can't even see the consequences ahead. Its sights are set squarely on how do we get comfort and relief right now. It's just stuck in the moment. So the inner critic, though, can see the future, and the inner critic part of us goes on the offensive, attacking the impaired ruminator with guilt and shame and contempt for self or others. But the ruminator has to protect itself, so it activates the king baby to employ defensive strategies, and we all know that as a wall of denial, rationalizing, minimizing, blaming, etc. I can quit anytime I want, and this is the only thing that helps. And so the king baby is actually a guardian of the hired guns of addiction and compulsion, and it's there to protect it. And its mantra is, I want what I want when I want it, and I want it now. So it's all focused on right here and right now, finding comfort and relief as things get worse. The depressive thinking then becomes stinking thinking. So this is a composite picture of the chaos happening internally just before we crash and burn, or what some people like to call hit bottom. And it all starts with the depressive thinking down here, which then triggers the emotionally arousing rumination over here, and then the subconscious trying to come to the rescue and getting burned out, leaving us tired and exhausted in the morning, and getting on the SSRIs, and the grouch comes out, and then the inner critic begins beating up on the depressive thinker for not being able to get balanced again. That's when the ruminator tries to hold it all together and brings in these hired guns to get us off the hamster wheel. And it works for a little while. We feel better, even maybe better than the serotonin has been helping. And so then when the inner critic sees the long term, the ruminator doesn't care about that. He only sees the short term, because remember, the ruminator gets impaired with the dumping of cortisol into the system, powering it down. So it's got a lot of weight on its shoulders. And so it brings in a guardian or a helper that we call the king baby. And the king baby and the inner critic fight it out. And then typically there's a family member or someone else that takes over the critic's job, leaving the person with these addictions and compulsions to protect itself, and they get better and better at being the king baby because they get practiced by other critics out externally. So, but it does come to a point, hopefully for most of us, that we hit bottom and we. So hitting bottom does have a silver lining. It puts people in a position to reach out for help. And when we do, help is available. Pain is optional. There is something that we can do, and it works for millions of people. It's called recovery. It teaches us a healthy living style. And the first thing that has to happen is that we transition out of the old life into the new life. And that's like learning something new, if you remember that analogy from some other videos. And at first it takes a little bit of work just to get on our feet, and sometimes we need to do that in an inpatient treatment center, at least for a few days, and sometimes for a month. And I did 28 days myself in treatment when I was 29 years old, and that's what put my feet on this path. And it was a very profound experience. And if you're suffering and have some of the same kind of things going on that I've described so far in this video, please reach out and ask for help. You won't be sorry once you get into it. Now, the reason I chose this background for showing the healthy living cycle is because in the iceberg, I talk about the fact that the true self is there. It's just like the sun shining behind the clouds, and the false self is all the abandonment, shame, and contempt, and all those survival mode parts of self that are involved in the cycle of depression and addiction and so forth. And sometimes the clouds can get pretty dark, but we can have faith that the true spiritual part of us is shining behind those clouds. Getting into recovery requires that we access that part of ourself. And when we do, then we find that we're able to think differently. In fact, in a 12-step program, the very first thing they teach us once we put the drink down or the drugs down or the cake down or whatever, then we have to take on the stinking thinking I mentioned in the previous slide. Stinking thinking is what keeps this cycle of addiction going and depression. So we need to have the opposite. We need to have healthy thinking. We can't get that until we get this homeostatic balance where we transition out of addiction and depression and into a process of recovery. And as we do that, then the stress response quiets down, the cortisol and the adrenaline gets flushed out of our system, and we start to find some peace in life, and we start to recuperate and find a homeostatic balance that all of the other systems begin coming back online, including our thinking brain. And so we start thinking recovery thoughts, and we start thinking healthy thoughts, and we start refuting those magical thoughts of childhood, the ones that keep us down. And as growth mode takes over and the cortisol's flushed out of the system, then the thinking brain comes back online full force. Now we're not ruminating. Now we're contemplating. We're in the problem-solving, contemplating, recovery-oriented thinking process. And that would involve thinking thoughts about spirituality and the purpose in life and having fun in healthy ways and being creative and growing. So having achieved that homeostatic balance of growth mode, then we experience a restful night's sleep. We start to have some peace and serenity. The weird dreams may go away or change into something a little more pleasant. We can feel the recuperation happening because the subconscious mind then gets to spend its time doing what it's supposed to do, which is maintaining the mind and body as we sleep. And returning to a healthy night's sleep, we can wake up feeling refreshed and motivated, energetic, so that we have healthy coping skills coming from our inner strength, and we find the energy to work out and to do the good things for our body to help it rebuild itself. So I want to be clear about something though at this point. This is the ideal, and many people have to go through an extended period of transition out of addiction and depression into the recovery state. Sometimes it gets worse before it gets better because usually there's a lot of unfinished business that needs to be taken care of and maybe wreckage in our life that needs to be cleaned up. But overall, we can find that peace and serenity, and as we do, the more we invest in our recovery, then the more of those moments we're going to have. And remember, neurons that fire together wire together, so we're building the neural architecture for recovery on the inside. And once that takes off, it becomes automatic. But at first, we really have to apply ourselves and keep doing what we need to be doing in order to get what we need to be getting. And so, again, it may become difficult at first, achieving transition and stabilization, but once we start rolling in that direction, recovery becomes very easy. Now, this diagram shows us another thing that's important to keep in mind. See, we don't transition or transform the inner critic. We need that inner critic. We just don't need it to be shaming anymore. We need it to be more like a mentor or a sponsor or an encourager. There's still a book of shoulds, and there still should be some discipline, and the inner critic can bring that along. Again, we just want it to tone down the shame-based motivational tactics. Those don't work very well. And again, that can trigger the stinking thinking if that's allowed to continue. So we have to get into talking with a sponsor, get into therapy, read the literature, do the things we need to find the healthy balance in thinking and discipline. And the good news is, at some point, our ability to enjoy life without drugs or alcohol, without sex or gambling, without eating too much, without working too much, without obsessing and compulsive behaviors, then we find that we can re-engage with our natural fun-loving selves, and we can learn to have fun and in many healthy, enjoyable ways. And what I have found is the best news of recovery is that it puts us in a position to connect with that true spiritual part of ourselves, the part of us that's connected to our higher power, the part of us that carries our spiritual values and beliefs. And that's the part that brings meaning and purpose to the world and to ourselves. And if you look at this picture, our inner world is much more harmonious, and all the parts are working together towards a common goal. And this is growth mode. This is self-actualization in process. And so this is the place we want to be, and this is a wonderful reward for the recovery. And even the pain involved in depression, addiction, and compulsion can lead us to a place where we are able to be open enough to receive this gift of healthy living. So thanks for listening and watching this video. I hope it's been helpful. And for any of you out there who are suffering or struggling with addiction or compulsion or depression or anxiety, and it just won't go away, and you've tried everything you can think of and you don't know where else to turn, then you can always reach out to anybody, but reach out to me if you want. Connect with me through my email or through one of the chat programs on my websites, or however you can, and just reach out and let me know, and I'll try my best to get you connected in your area.